Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Mimi Calter. I'm the Vice Provost and University Librarian here at WashU. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the William H. Gass Centenary Celebration. Thank you for joining us, whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us online, as we honor the legacy of one of our most venerable WashU community members over the past 60-plus years. To help us do this, we have former students, colleagues, and friends all with us today, and I really look forward to hearing their stories of Gass's lasting influence on their lives and their careers. The WashU Library is proud to have the William H. Gass papers in its modern literature collection, and we are also grateful for the longtime support that he gave us, which even preceded his time at WashU. I also very much want to thank his widow, Mary Gass, for continuing that support, and also very much for helping make this occasion possible. Thanks also go to Jacqueline Halaz from WashU Advancement, who was very involved in making this happen, so thanks very much. And really to all of our whole events team. It does take a fair amount of work to put a program like this together, and I appreciate the efforts that everyone has made. Okay, so the program today is just one of the ways that we are celebrating Gass this year and really beyond this year. Another bit of celebration that I'm excited about is the exhibits that we have available. There are actually two. The first, a traditional one, William H. Gass, 50 New Acquisitions, is currently on display in Olin Library. It'll be there until January 31st. You will find it in the foyer around the grand staircase and also inside the Special Collections Reading Room, which is on the first floor. I encourage you to go over and have a look. Then we have a separate but certainly related digital exhibit that is available online. It is entitled William H. Gass, The Soul Inside the Sentence. It's a life-spanning exhibit of Gass's work. It was actually first launched in 2013, but it's been updated and enhanced for the occasion of the Centenary, and it includes digitized versions of many of the materials that you will see in the physical exhibit that's currently in Olin. So I'm excited about that. We have some celebratory giveaways at the information table. If you haven't got one already, you'll find a beautiful new postcard with a QR code for Soul Inside the Sentence to help you find it. We also have a really stunning new Gass broadside that was a collaboration between the libraries and the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Art. And we have a limited number of copies of an illustrated catalog that Gass wrote for an exhibit that he curated in Special Collections to inaugurate the Writer Center in 1991. It is very much a collector's item, so get back there and get your copy. And so, lastly, as part of our centenary celebration, we are inviting alumni and others who have memories of Gass to submit those memories to us using an online form that you can access from the event page on the library's website. There's also a QR code at the information table to direct you to it. We're really looking forward to, we're hoping to receive your input so that we can include some of these excerpts from some of these reflections online. We really want to be able to continue to attest to Gass's lasting impact on WashU, on St. Louis, really beyond that, even after the centenary year is over. So please do take some time to contribute your memories. With that, it is my role to introduce Ted Morrissey, who's going to be moderating our first panel. Ted is an accomplished fiction writer and a lecturer at Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program. For the past 15 years, his primary scholarly interest has been in Gass. He's studied and promoted Gass's work through articles, conference papers, scholarly monographs, and The Tunnel at 25, an online symposium. And he is currently editing William H. Gass at 100 essays. So please join me in welcoming Ted and our panel of speakers.
Well, thank you for that introduction and also for the honor of chairing this panel, moderating this panel. You'll have to forgive us. This is our first time through an unrehearsed panel, so we'll do our best here for you. But also let me just thank Joel and the Special Collections folk, as I always try to do when I can, because they just do an excellent job, as you all know, and the support of me and other scholars across a wide range of interests is just pretty amazing. I've never had opportunity that I didn't need some help, and they weren't right there to give assistance and so forth. So I really appreciate that. So we're going to kind of just stick with the program here. We have three accomplished panelists here, and we're just going to kind of go in order. And when we go in order, they're going to go to the microphone there at the lectern and kind of give a few prepared remarks. And then after all three are done, come back here, I suspect, to the table and have a little bit of an informal discussion. Meanwhile, we want to make sure that we have a little bit of time at the end for you to ask some questions. So kind of be thinking about that perhaps as they deliver their remarks and so on. So without further ado, let me begin to introduce them. I'll just give a few bits of their bio before they speak, and then I'll do that before each one. So our first speaker is going to be Patrick Davis. Patrick is the founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of Unbound Edition Press. He also publishes the literary journal Revel, which he seems to have brought a couple copies of, which is cool. Mr. Davis is a lifetime voting member of the National Book Critics Circle. He writes poetry, essays, literary criticism, and reviews. And he was generously mentored by William Gass during his graduate studies at WashU from 1990 to 1997. So if you would, please help me welcome Mr. Patrick Davis.
Or artifacts, whichever you might prefer to call them. And in Bill's and Gertrude Stein's honor, some tender buttons that contain some things that Bill was kind enough to say to me in the years I got to spend working with him. A lot, of course, has changed at WashU since the early and mid-90s. When I was last here, the great Carl Phillips was just arriving. Stephen Meyer had published his magnificent volume on Stein. Naomi Lebowitz was teaching with the inimitable passion that only Naomi can teach with. Stanley Elkin was still writing. Howard Nemiroff was still with us. And so we get to remember the great influences on our life together. And that seems to me what's so meaningful about being here together today. And I'm incredibly honored to be included. The lens that focused my literary life came before my eyes on Thursday, January 23rd, 1986. It was around 1:30 p.m. I remember this with such specificity because of the profound impact a single sentence had on me. I was taking an undergraduate course at Stetson University, taught by a deeply intelligent, kind, and giving professor named Michael Raymond. It was called From Story to Anti-Story. He had assigned In the Heart of the Country by William H. Gass. It was in that story where I read, "It's true. There are moments, foolish moments, ecstasy on a tree stump, when I'm all but gone. Scattered, I like to think like seed. For I'm the sort now in the fool's position of having love left over, which I'd like to lose. What good is it now to me? Candy, ungiven after Halloween." If that's what language could do, then I was all in. I changed my major to English that afternoon. I was a misguided economics major. It was the 80s after all. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the influence of M.H. Abrams on Gass's work. I had no idea until much later that Abrams had himself guided Gass through his own dissertation. And I should say, I think the way Abrams taught Bill to read is ultimately what Bill taught me, was how to read, that everything has some reference and you must go to the source. And then I set my sights on Washington University. A single sentence had redirected my life. It would not be the last time. One of the glorious challenges of Bill's work is that it is inexhaustibly quotable. Every sentence is special, made so by the love of language he gave to each one that he wrote. I will quote from him today, but not from his texts, rather from things he said to me that continue to shape me and might be a balm to you today in these frightening times. These are the quotes that are on the buttons. During graduate school here, a period marked by Bill's extraordinary generosity toward me and the English department's ceaseless patience with my feeble attempts at scholarship, he said to me, "The suffering is the point. If you are willing to suffer for an idea, you can prevent terrible things from happening in the world." But I'd had enough of suffering, and instead I prostituted what talent I had as a hired pen, as a consultant to major publishing houses for 25 years. I became, at best, literary adjacent. Then I had the most profound of breakdowns across the board in every way. My health and my mind collapsed from deep exhaustion and from ignoring the truth of my own literary life. To recover, I returned to the source, Bill's sentences. In 2017, as I was barely hanging on to life, just as Bill was starting to let go, I picked up Middle C, his last novel. Gertrude Stein had taught us loving repeating, and it was Gass's repetitions of a single sentence in his final book that saved my life. I could hear the rhythm of love repeatedly applied on the page again. I was returned to the focused, arresting moment in 1986 from in the heart of the country. I had found my center, my middle, my life's sentences again. In reflecting on the books I had read, I thought of Bill's early publishers, David Godine, Dalkey Archive, Conjunctions, of course, and others who saw serious literature as worthwhile, who put art above mere commerce. I decided to start Unbound Edition Press in honor of them all and what they had done to focus, shape, and save my life. Among our happiest achievements is an experimental anthology, not just an anthology of some experimental writing, exceptional as it is, but an anthology experimental in form. It is unbound, can be reordered, and appears to be a random shuffle of papers. It is not. Truth be told, it is inspired by Bill's masterpiece, The Tunnel, and contains work by him, photographs, lecture notes, tucked inside. His views of the city of St. Louis frame Robert Hass's Soul Notebook, a poetic reflection upon another city. There is nothing random about the shuffle of papers here. Bill once said to me, with a blank page, everything becomes possible. This got him into some trouble with Willie Master's Lonesome Wife at the time of its publication, but it has also inspired us in publishing our literary journal, Revel. I'm overjoyed to share that the next issue of Revel, Revel 3, There go my buttons. This is Revel 1 and 2. Revel 3 will contain transcripts from this centenary celebration and previously unpublished fiction by William H. Gass. I would like to share also that all of our books, the anthology, Revel, or other titles, are all designed right here in University City by the brilliant designers Eleanor Safe and Joseph Floresco. It is my dream, and just that one day we might be able to design and publish a true author's edition of The Tunnel on its 35th anniversary, bringing all of Bill's design notes for the book to life. With a blank page, everything is possible. Who knows, but we can dream. I would like to conclude with a bit of the introduction to The Experiment Will Not Be Bound, and a story about Bill included in it. It is also very much worth noting that the anthology contains a beautiful foreword called Time is an Author, along with photographs by Bill's daughter, Catherine Gass. No text is sacred, but every writer is. On a brightly cold April morning in 1995, I walked with William H. Gass across the front quad, spreading wide just inside the archway at Washington University in St. Louis. I asked him how he was doing after referencing Robert Alter's particularly brutal review of The Tunnel that had just been published in the New Republic. It read, "Some may seize on it as a postmodern masterpiece, but it is a bloated monster of a book. The bloat is a consequence of sheer adipose verbosity and an unrelenting condition of moral and intellectual flatulence. Gass's real achievement is to have produced a complete compendium of the vices of postmodern writing." "Oh, I am great," Gass replied to me. "You must remember, it's very important to be hated by the right people." That's one of the buttons. In that moment, I understood the strength and depth of my mentor's literary character, the titanium rod of an intellectual backbone that held tall his philosophy of aesthetics. And I also understood Alter's failing as a critic in this instance. He had missed entirely the flatulent puns on Gass's own name, the universal intestinal tunnel running ripe and rancid through the heart of every human being, the anal-centric imagery of the insignia worn with pride by the party of the disappointed people and their assholes. As imagined by Gass's narrator, William Kohler, Alter missed the self-awareness and intentionality of The Tunnel and its author alike. In short, Alter missed the book. Life is shit. The best any human can do is to make bearable through art, through experimenting with the creation of meaning where none exists. Should that fail, the only choice remaining is to dig one's own grave or dig a way through, to tunnel out. This reminds me of a particular moment in class I think you'll probably hear again and again of how generous Bill was to everyone, how he made time for those of us not worthy or ready for it is beyond me, but he did. He came to a class I was teaching to undergraduates one time. We were reading On Being Blue as an example of what an essay really could be. And I was thrilled that the students would get to meet and talk with an author. And a particularly naive young woman who, let's say, was still growing into her thinking, said to him, "So you're a philosopher, right?" And he said, "Yes." And I honestly think she meant this unironically and with originality. She said, "So can you tell me what the meaning of life is?" And he kind of pivoted very decisively. I wouldn't call it a glare, but she had gotten his attention. And he said simply, "Signs have meaning. Life is not a sign. This is why we write." Still, nearly 30 years on, readers might now forgive Alter's review of Gass's masterpiece. After all, the book was not published as Gass intended, and this surely contributed to critics like Alter mistakenly reading it as a traditional book at all. The Tunnel is an experience, not a narrative. It is a shuffled stack of supposedly random pages, not a linear story. It was, and may remain, beyond readers limited by traditional notions of reading. That is understandable. The Tunnel is a profound testament to the impossibility of writing bankrupt ideas into acceptable form, to justifying the unjustifiable. It is an unyielding study of morally induced writer's block. And because The Tunnel casts history's most hideous moments in Gass's lush prose, the work also places the reader in the same sort of moral blockage. Gass balanced Kohler's writer's block with a morally induced reader's block. Is the text vile or vibrant? Can content be consumed separately from form, like the broth from a soup? How one answers reveals the character of the reader, not the writer. Was it for this, Wordsworth asks in the prelude, Western literature's other great contemplation on writer's block? Gass, a postmodernist steeped in the Romantics, answers Wordsworth's question with The Tunnel. Yes, this terrifying fallen world is all there is, and so the experiment to make it tolerable must continue. This is why writers write. Perhaps readers and some critics would have been able to understand The Tunnel more easily upon publication if the book had been brought to the reading public in the form the author intended. Form for Gass was inseparable from meaning, the way the body is inseparable from the language it produces. Gass's design notes for the Tunnel make it clear. This manuscript will naturally be manufactured and presented to the public as a book, and it will be a real book, no doubt about that, but it must not be a book symbolically. Symbolically, it is just a heap of pages on various topics with the narrator has shuffled together. This must seem to be the case, although at another level, the work is tightly organized and determined. Gass also wanted the Tunnel bound in, quote, rough black cloth. He felt, too, that, quote, it is important that my name appear nowhere on dust jacket or cover, and that nothing else be put on the jacket. No bio, no picture, blurb, etc. Why not put the author's name on the book? Because it is Kohler's book. Because, in a sense, it is not a book. Because in the reality of the novel itself is dispersed between the pages of another book. In a 2019 article titled "A 1995 Novel Predicted Trump's America," Alec Navala-Lee wrote in the New York Times that even under the best of circumstance, this plotless book of over 600 pages, The Tunnel, would have been one of the least commercially viable novels ever released by a major publishing house. And it had the additional misfortune of appearing halfway through a decade that was uniquely unprepared for its despairing vision of America. Gass, far ahead of his time in predicting the rise of American fascism, had to concede some of his design vision for the tunnel to the commercial interests of his publisher. Gass was ahead of his time too in his unrelenting support for Salman Rushdie, risking his own safety on a highly secretive trip to visit the targeted author in 1992. He returned from the trip to Boulder, Colorado, with a plan to hand-make and distribute buttons reading, "I am Salman Rushdie," to authors far and wide. Commercialism was never his interest. Lifting and protecting international writers was. And in this anthology, there is reproduced the original "I am Salman Rushdie" button, which Catherine remembers Bill making by hand with a little button maker. While the experiment will not be bound as no pastiche of the tunnel, it is an homage to its bold experimental vision and to William H. Gass's support of daring writers. Likewise, it is an homage to every writer who believes the experiment of writing, of books, of making and unmaking and remaking meaning must continue, one sentence, one line at a time. Some of those are included in this seemingly random heap of shuffled papers contained in rough black cloth. There is no name or title on this anthology in honor of Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Our next panelist is Michelle Komie. Michelle is publisher for art and architecture at Princeton University Press, where she has worked since 2014. She previously worked in acquisitions at Yale University Press for 13 years. She holds a BA and a BFA from Washington University.
There are a lot of tender buttons. I had the great privilege of working with Bill Gass and Lauren Cuoco at the International Writers Center, which is the scholarly project that Bill turned to at WashU when he retired from teaching. And it was enmeshed in the university, but it faced outward. It addressed St. Louis and it addressed the world. I was in my early 20s when I had this job that I had for 3 years. This was my first job. And there is not a day that goes by, a week that goes by, that I don't feel and recall and feel that the resonance of that privilege. What a thing to have as one's first job, this 3-year brush with brilliance that I had on a daily basis. I graduated from Washington University in 1997. I loved my coursework, but inspiration and influence also happen in the everything else. All the conditions and connections that occur outside the classroom, in a gallery, a visitor's lecture, or a space like this one. I first encountered William Gass in the everything else when he introduced William Gaddis at a conference organized by the International Writers Center in 1994 called The Writer in Religion. I can still recall Bill's pitch-perfect recitation of Gaddis's famous line from J.R., "Merry Christmas," he threatened. But the more powerful memory is the sensation of Bill's speech, the weaving of his words as they unfurled in dense clusters and focused tunnels. I'd never heard anything like William Gass reading aloud from a text he'd written, even an introduction to a talk delivered from behind a podium. I found my way to some freelance transcription, typing up one of the conference's panel discussions from a recording, and received the rare opportunity to type Bill's spoken prose as I listened to it, over and over, setting the cassette player to one of its slowest speeds, rewinding repeatedly to catch and correctly place all those commas. The International Writers Center was part of the culture of the university, facing outward toward the wider world, bringing many of the globe's most renowned writers to St. Louis. The fall of 1997, after I graduated, was packed with programming. The conference and exhibition, The Dual Muse, the writer as artist, the artist as writer, took place in November, bringing Derek Walcott, Brayton Breitenbach, Jennifer Bartlett, Tom Phillips, and others to campus. As Derek Walcott said, bowing his head in an auditorium in Steinberg, when the great man calls, you come. When Bill called, or more likely wrote a letter, people came. David Foster Wallace opened that year's reading series in December to an audience of hundreds, many leaning against the walls and sitting on the floor. Despite the heat, Wallace wore his beanie and long black coat and read from a text that would appear a year and a half later in brief interviews with hideous men. I started full-time at the center in January of 1998. It was located in Clayton, in a distant hallway of the underground West Campus Conference Center, a center within another center, in the former famous bar building on Forsyth Boulevard. We shared the building solely with long-term library storage. No one ever casually wandered by. A visitor really had to know where they were going. In terms of location, the International Writers Center was to Washington University as St. Louis was to New York. It was far from the perceived center of things. I worked there until July of 2001 when Bill retired. In that time, I saw many people make their way to our basement and to Bill. His generosity was extraordinary. I don't think he ever declined a request for a conversation or interview from a visiting writer, a nervous student, or the New York Times. Together with Lauren Cuoco, the founding associate director, the center served the university and the city for a decade. In addition to its public programming, an annual reading series, 3 conferences, and the monthly St. Louis Literary Calendar, it published 5 books, one of which, Literary St. Louis, A Guide, evolved from the driving tours Bill and Lauren used to give visiting writers. It celebrated the histories of the many authors who were born here, like Samuel Clemens, Tennessee Williams, Kate Chopin, and T.S. Eliot, or who, like Bill, found their way to St. Louis and stayed. 22 students worked on the book, mostly conducting research. Several contributed to its text, including me. Now we are in the far reaches of the everything else, on the second and third steps of a path that led to my career today. WashU never promised me this, but through Bill, it delivered. I've worked in art book publishing for 23 years. Before arriving at Yale University Press, I didn't stop to earn a graduate degree. I never worked at a literary magazine or sifted through a slush pile. I never asked what an agent does. I never attended a New York book launch. I never sat down with an author to discuss their writing and how it might evolve. But I worked for Bill Gass. Those years provided so much of this training for me. Bill was a brilliant novelist and critic housed in a philosophy department who loved architecture and was a passionate photographer, lifelong pursuits shared with and inspired by Mary and Catherine. He wrote his way through, around, and among disciplinary boundaries. He found inspiration from high to low and back again in the work of Rilke, Stein, Joyce, and Flaubert, in windows, and even in the gigantic Amico sign at the corner of Skinker and Clayton. As I shape the list of titles I publish, now in the upper hundreds, I've noticed that I strongly prefer work that faces outward, that connects to other fields, that stretches the boundaries of a discipline or ignores them altogether. I have a difficult time with writerly egos or ungenerous behavior from highly esteemed people, because I know that greatness and generosity can go hand in hand, and I saw this from the very best. How much did I learn by typing Bill's longhand letters, from his questions, comments, and conversation, from attending those events and the parties that followed them at Bill's and Mary's lovely home, sitting across from Bill at welcome dinners with writers and absorbing his incredible wit, humor, and kindness, more than I can ever say. Generous in mind as well as time, Bill's interests and professional worlds expanded my own. Because of him, I learned to read the architecture of a word, a phrase, a paragraph, and a page. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Our final panelist here is Gerhild Williams, or the more common American pronunciation, Professor Williams. Professor Williams has published widely on German and French literature and culture from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, specializing more recently in the 16th and 17th centuries. She has been working in translation theory and practice, the early modern witch phenomenon, and the development of the novel. Her bio goes on, but she tells me one of her current projects is getting used to being a retiree. So, thank you, Professor Williams.
Thank you. Thank you. It is great to be here and honor Bill for all of us. In 1986, and we heard more about that date just recently, Lynn Tadlock, my colleague and friend, and I co-organized the 8th Symposium on German Literature on the topic of literature and the cosmos. We asked Bill Gass to start us off, and starting us he did, with a sentence typical for his quirkily profound style, quote, "Let us imagine a world without language, a world," he continues, "undisturbed by anybody's elaborated longings, a world untroubled by beliefs, concerns, conjectures, dreams, a world without lies, with nothing we are willing to die for, a world which by default would be in peace," unquote. I knew William Gass as a colleague, a friend, distinguished and award-winning writer, and of course, as devoted father of Liz and Catherine and husband of Mary, who in her own right contributed much to Bill's success as a writer and to the center's success. Bill's excellence as a writer was only exceeded by the irreverence with which he undermined authority in a language that was and is as subversive as it is complicatedly clear, shimmering with great beauty and unexpected metaphors. Authority was ever the target of his writing, whether openly denounced or quietly undermined in his words. This linguistic target practice was doubly remarkable if one considers that Bill served in the US Navy, an organization not exactly known for its tolerance of quirky linguistic disrespect. And with this, I'm already deeply into the 3 qualities, habits of mind, if you will, which I admired in Bill Gass: his linguistic brilliance, we heard about it, his courage, and his acerbic sense of humor. So let's talk regarding his linguistic brilliance and creativity. Coolly dismissive of banality to sharply disapproving of sloppiness in thought, words, and actions, Bill's intolerance of the careless use of language earned him the prize-winning admiration and envy of many, including myself. As a non-native speaker of English, my awe for Bill's way with words was boundless, as was my envy. I admire the English language and people who can work it into its most efficient, translucent, and militant beauty. I saw in Bill a most skillful, even at often lonely practitioner of its unruly splendor. In 1999, Bill published Reading Rilke, in which he translated selected works of Rainer Maria Rilke, a kindred spirit whose art celebrates the German language. He, by the way, was a poet of the mid-century, 1900s. The German language as it gives voice as much to beauty as in human suffering. Quote, "Translating," Bill wrote in the foreword to the volume, "is reading of the best, most essential kind," unquote. Bill celebrated Rilke's voice and artistry in earthy tones. Quote, "The poet is pushed into a realm of forms where language glows as ghosts glow, as unsubstantial as the worm's light," unquote. To share Bill's linguistic high-wire act translating this challenging poet, I did many times ask Bill to speak to my students in my translation seminars. He always graciously agreed, describing his work with Heide Ziegler, distinguished scholar, translator, and at the time, president of the University of Stuttgart. He described how, with her support, each poem became his own without losing Rilke. Students praised their work with them as high points of my seminars. He taught them much about the challenge as well as the achievements of translating poetry, especially translating a poet such as Rilke, when approached by a magician with words such as Bill. So, talking about his courage. There was a time when hardly a committee of import or any publication showcasing Washington University would reach the public without a contribution by Bill, and I never remember Bill refusing to take on yet another task in the service of this institution. I also remember an especially challenging search committee where everyone was talking at cross purposes. We've all been part of those. Finally, Bill got up, quietly pointing to the list of names about whom we were to decide. He made clear in which direction the search was to move, and it did. Bill Gass and Lauren Coco, as director and associate director respectively, led the International Writers Center for 10 years. The original idea for the center came from Jim McLeod, with his amazing combo of brilliance and practicality. His idea in its execution was supported by then Chancellor Bill Danforth, Chancellor Mark Wrighton, Provost Ed Macias, and Executive Vice Chancellor Dick Roloff. This dynamic foursome supported Bill and Lauren, who during the decade of its existence brought everybody who was anybody in the world of writing and translating to St. Louis, to the center, and to Washington University. There were overflow readings, conferences on local and global themes, which yielded publications still very much worth reading, especially given our current interest in local and global politics. I very much encourage you to read the introduction to the collection of The Writer in Politics, which is a wild ride through the theme from Socrates to yesterday, with countless fascinating aperçus in between. In 2001, you heard it a minute ago, Bill fervently supported bringing Salman Rushdie to campus, who was then just coming out of the fatwa declared on his life. Bill's letter to the Assembly Series Committee is still inspiring reading as an indictment against letting fear rule our decisions and an equally passionate endorsement of academic freedom. Here, Bill stated firmly that, quote, nothing outweighs academic freedom. This freedom means that each of us must suffer the speech of fools, zealots, and enemies. We should do so gladly, unquote. And as a fitting comment on what we witness in our community these days, he writes, those who feel they finally hold the truth in their hands should hold it then as if grateful for its arrival, not in a frightened fist, but in an open palm. For not even a mighty gale, let alone the wind of a few words, can blow the truth away. Differences do not frighten the truly open-minded, unquote. Bill Gass' writing will never stop challenging our ways of employing words and our intention in doing so. And his were still, and still always are, magnificently on target. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Williams. I do want to have an opportunity to have a little discussion up here with our panelists, and obviously, as I mentioned, any of you who have some questions, maybe we'll just spend a few minutes hopefully having a bit of a conversation here and then make sure we save some time to have some questions from the audience. I'm not sure what time we want to for sure wrap up. I know next 4:05. Okay, thanks. So no, those are all fascinating. Joel and Ali Chetwynd and I did a panel at the American Literature Association conference in May, and Ali in particular talked about the legacy of Gass as a model for students, meaning both in terms of looking at his stories, his essays, etc., as models, but also looking at his, essays and interviews in terms of literary theory and talking to students about that. I know in my courses, both my graduate and undergraduate courses, Gass is a sort of a specter that's always hanging around in the digital classroom, because even if he's not on the reading list, which he often is, I'm always quoting him and talking to my students about his theory about this and about that. So anyway, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how Gass's legacy will be kind of upheld, perhaps specifically in the classroom, as both a model through his writing, but also his thoughts on literature and so on.
I think it will be challenging for a period of time. In an age of sound bites and disposable content, we are not necessarily teaching as deeply or as broadly as we could. And I think learning to read difficult texts is a gymnasium for the mind. It teaches us to have the strong muscle of critical thinking. And I think that Bill's model of reading deeply and widely and not being afraid to point to what is a worthy model might now be called elitism, but I think it matters. I think we have to be willing to separate the wheat from the chaff and call out exemplary work and study exemplary work deeply. I'm not sure that we presently have the discipline of mind to do that as a culture. So I have some worry, but I do think that, as I did, people will return to his sentences because they are a life spring.
Maybe just to make sure we get them in, does anyone in the audience have a question or two? I'll be happy to repeat them so we can get them aired here.
I would like to make a comment on something else. It was briefly mentioned in talk with my colleagues here that Bill was also really an exceptional photographer. And I had the honor of getting a photograph of his and framed it, and it's sitting right next to my fireplace at my house. And it's a photograph of a water-soaked cardboard piece. And it is just gorgeous. And it is just what he would do, looking at something that the rest of us wouldn't see, neither the beauty nor the drama in it, and he would see it, and then he worked together with Joe, what was his name, the photographer across? Eastman, yeah, he worked with John Eastman. He worked with him with Eastman's pictures and his essays, and those also are just amazing documents of Bill's eye and Bill's language and Eastman's eye and his artistry. And I think that is something that will also continue, not only influence us as we look at Bill's writing and everything, but also the way we look at St. Louis and the various parts he found in St. Louis, the beauty in the decrepitness of some of the areas that he would witness. He actually had quite a bit of guts going into areas in St. Louis that maybe many of us would just maybe be a little bit careful about. And he would be just in there and taking pictures and then presenting it, and many of them were also exhibited in the center. So that's besides his writing and everything which has been talked about eloquently, I really admired his courage in meetings, in committees, as I mentioned, everything. He was never afraid to say what not only was on his mind, but what was right on target. And that was really admirable, besides the many other things we admire about him. So, thank you.
Any questions out there? Yes. Okay, thank you. Did anyone want to respond to that in any way? I mentioned this to Joel earlier in the week. I just recently got Booth Literary Journal number 19, and there's a supplement by Michael Martone in there, a memoir, and it's composed of a bunch of little vignettes, one per page, and two of the vignettes have to do with gas. One where Michael talks about driving around Indiana. He's from Fort Wayne originally, driving around Indiana looking for B. You know, he was absolutely mesmerized by In the Heart of the Country and wanted to try to track it down, and then another reference kind of later on. So I guess in a sense, from Michael's book, one gets this idea of gases almost sort of mythologizing the Midwest somewhat. And again, that sort of, you know, plays off of the idea of being somewhat left of New York, you know, in terms of geography. So what about this idea of mythologizing the Midwest and sort of, you know, embracing being a Midwestern author? Does anyone have any thoughts on the panel regarding that? He hopes.
I mentioned that, so this is my copy of Literary St. Louis, which is so wonderful. And this is kind of, I mean, I'm sure that Bill, you can open a page and right away you know whether it was written by Bill or not, one of the rest of us. And he also, not only did he write the biographies of some of the more prominent figures like Samuel Clemens, but he wrote the sections on the neighborhoods in St. Louis that introduced each region. And he really, really loved the lesser-known figures like the newspapermen. He loved the newspapermen, William Marion Reedy, Joseph Pulitzer, and he especially loved the strangest, oddball stories like Patience Worth, who was a character from a Ouija board of another writer. And this stuff just cracked him up. He would be in his office and he'd come out and he'd read something, laugh, and then go back in and probably type it up perfectly. So there are sentences in here, and this is so deeply St. Louis. It's St. Louis in ways you did not even know existed in St. Louis. I think he loved driving very esteemed people around in his tiny, what kind of car was that? It was the smallest car you've ever seen. Which was it? It was a Ford Festiva. So he would drive Mario Vargas Llosa around St. Louis and show them these, you know, beautiful brownstones and all of the glorious red brick that is, you know, suffuses this beautiful city. He'd take people to the Mississippi so they could put their hands in the water if they wanted to do that, and many people did. But I think this book is a really wonderful example of how much he loved this city, and I know his love of the Midwest and this region in particular also suffuses so much of his writing, his literature, and his fiction.
Yeah, I've thought about this a bit and am working on a paper about this very subject. I think certainly while his work mythologizes the Midwest, It also is not afraid of looking at the underbelly of the Midwest. There's often a dark mythology, the way Flannery O'Connor might have spoken of good country people in the South. In the heart of the country is a heartbreaking story, and we can't ignore that the tunnel explores the dark heart of America. These two books are in conversation with each other, both set in the Midwest, and the evil that might be lurking just underneath the smile or behind the white picket fence. We can't ignore stories like the Peterson Kid or Mrs. Mean. These are not celebrations of friendly Midwestern handshakes. They're the opposite. So I do think there's a mythology there, but I think maybe there's a subtext that is worth turning attention to as well.
Well, I'll just mention kind of going outward now. Obviously you mentioned your publication of The Tunnel, which is really interesting. I was contacted by someone in Greece just a couple months ago who is working on a Greek translation of Cartesian Sonata. I don't know if they're doing it on spec or with a publisher, or I'm not sure what all the mechanics are, but I had sung the praises of that collection at the panel that I mentioned earlier, and that probably is what alerted someone to my feeling about that, so they were trying to get my input on some trickier phrases. So I guess one of my hopes is that that's just one of many examples that Gass's words will continue to just keep filtering outward into other languages and other cultures and so forth. I've delivered papers in Singapore and Lisbon, and next summer I'm committed to go to Killarney, Ireland, which is, it's really, it's a big stretch for me to want to go there, but to do a paper, and maybe Lisbon again. So anyway, I'm hoping that the translation work and just the talking about Gass's work beyond the bounds of the U.S. will continue to move forward as well. Anyone have any kind of final thoughts, either in the audience or among our panelists? Yeah, it's in back there.
My career started here. I didn't know it at the time, and I think one of the most important things a university can do is provide these affiliate professional experiences for students while you're here. There's so much, whether it's a magazine or as a work-study job in the library or the gallery, the publications department, so many different programs have publications, have a facet of publications work. It could be online, it could be in print, it could be digital, it doesn't really matter. But I think to get your head around that, the richness and the pace and the life cycle of a publication is really important. And it's very, very transferable and very, very applicable. So if you're working at Student Life right now, that's hugely applicable to so many other things, and you can expand it from an illustrated article to a longer piece, to a longer piece, to a book. They're very transferable skills. And I don't know, when Bill Gass set out to found the International Writers Center, I don't know if he was thinking, maybe, maybe not, I'm also going to give this generation of undergraduates, some of whom were English majors, some of whom were not. They found their way to the center down the hallways. This extraordinary experience by pulling them into my professional life. And we're getting faxes from his agent, and we're corresponding with Harper's Magazine because he's placing a piece. And that was all part of what we were allowed to do as students. So I think, I'm not sure what's available now in 2024 and 2025 at WashU, but working with a professor who's working on a book, and there are many, finding that person and just being alongside them and assisting them, I think has certainly set me on my way.
Thank you. I'm sorry, did you have a quick response to that? We kind of need to wrap up a little bit here.
Yep, sure. I would just say for entering the literary world, the current game is set up that you push everything through submittable and you hope to get something placed in a journal. And that is very, very difficult. It is not very productive. Being part of a literary community in any way that you can, whether it's writing for a student paper, whether it's working in the library or in a writer center, is absolutely essential. It's a very small world, and people have to know people who connect you to other people. And I wish it weren't that way. I wish it were more open, but the relationships absolutely matter. Nothing is more important to an editor than the craft on the page, period. Don't try to be trendy, try to be true. That's all I can say about that.
Yes. I want to mention comparative literature, which teaches courses in writing, one of our teachers sitting there, Matthias Göritz, and also every semester presents the products of these seminars to a wider public. So that is absolutely a place where one could go and get involved in not only in doing it, but also in then making the connection with the various writers that are associated with comparative literature. And thought now is the department. But that is a really, really rich and important resource.
Thank you for the question and the great responses. And let's give our panelists a round of applause here.